Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. And on this week's episode, Moorepark researchers Brendan Horan and Laurence Shalloo discuss why the most profitable farmers are the most environmentally efficient. And Laurence started by looking back on the first signs of expansion following signals of milk quota abolition.
Yeah, I suppose the first indication came from the EU that quotas were going to be abolished in 2015, in 2008. And essentially that meant that there was going to be a relaxation of quotas in the sense that there was additional quota for Ireland and there was a relaxation in some of the policies around fat adjustments in quota. So farmers since 2007, 2008 have actually started to react and started to generate more heifer calves. And now we can see, as of 2018, we have about 380,000 additional cows when we compare ourselves to the base of 2007 to 2009. So farmers are preparing for expansion and are expanding with a long time, and we can see that in terms of the increases in milk output at farm level.
And Brendan, when we look at, I suppose, the whole area of expansion, and there's a huge, sustainability is a big buzzword. When we look at that expansion, has there been an impact of the expansion on the environmental output? In a negative regard, have we become more efficient?
Well, there's negatives and positives. So for instance, for any of the sustainability indicators that are linked to productivity, such as, green or carbon footprint per kilo of product or nutrient use efficiency, those indicators have improved by, between 8 and 10% over the last 5-6 years because of the increased productivity that's been achieved at farm level. But there again, there are certain indicators that aren't linked to productivity, such as our total emissions or emissions per hectare. And because of the increase in cow numbers, for instance, our total emissions per hectare have increased by about 12% during that period. So there are some positives and some negatives arising from that.
And if we take a step back then and look at the overall environmental footprint that we have in Ireland based on our system of production, I suppose, if we look at our markets, there's an image that Ireland is, I suppose, clean, green, grass-based. Where is our environmental footprint if we compare ourselves to other countries in Europe or our competitors internationally? Sure.
So I suppose we're not particularly intensive. If you look at the EU stats, we're right in the middle of the range in terms of nitrogen surpluses, in terms of utilisable agricultural area and stocking rates and so on. And because we're grass-based and don't have such requirements for big importation of feed and so on, our emissions per kilo of product are much lower than other countries. So, for instance, we're about a kilo of CO2 equivalent per kilo of milk. That's very favourable in the EU terms, about half the global figure, and much lower than most of the other big dairy industries that we deal with. In terms of nitrogen surpluses, again, we're in the middle of the range. In terms of the EU, again, much lower than intensive dairy industries across Europe. So the grass-based model is allowing us to be very sustainable at a mid-level of intensity in terms of European context at least.
And on that, are we selling that enough? Are we displaying those advantages more, or should we display those advantages more than we are?
I think we do. I think we do sell them, and increasingly we're communicating with customers about the characteristics of how food is produced here. But, you have to remember other countries are doing that too, and I suppose we have to, I think, differentiate ourselves more and more as we go ahead. And, with improving technology around measurement of foods and so on, we can, state more clearly over time how the provenance of our food and how it compares with that of others in other industries.
Just to jump in, if we look at it, and Brendan mentioned it, internationally, the average footprint of milk is 2.5 kilos of CO2 per kilo of milk. In Ireland, it's just about 1. So the actual expansion in Ireland has dramatically reduced the global footprint of milk. So, sometimes we stand back and we say, oh, this expansion is bad, it's increasing emissions. Yes, it is increasing emissions, but when we compare ourselves internationally, we look at the international market, we're actually reducing global emissions when more Irish product is on that market, and we shouldn't forget that.
Just, I suppose, to add to it then, in terms of, I suppose our contribution, agriculture is significantly important in Ireland, and that's quite unique. It's around 30% of our emissions come from agriculture, whereas it's only about 10% at EU level. So we have to, we will have to make significant contributions in terms of, for instance, the climate change agenda, in terms of the national targets and so on going forward. So I suppose we're in a good position, but we definitely have to contribute more, and we can do that with the type of technology we have.
And if we just turn our attention then to financials for a few minutes, Laurence, we discuss financials a lot on the show. We had Emma Dillon, an ag economist, most recently, and she told us that in 2018, dairy incomes in Ireland were in excess of €60,000. If we look at income in terms of net profit per hectare, where is the average farmer at the moment, and where's the top 10% farmer?
So if we look at it, and there are, I suppose, quite a range in terms of profitability, but if we look at the best farmers are somewhere around, and again, 2008, taking 1 year is not a good idea. If we look at over a range of years, our best farmers can make a profit of somewhere up to €2,200 per hectare, our top 10% of farmers, whereas our average are probably sitting at somewhere around €1,200 or €1,300. If we look at that across the scale of the industry, at a 50 hectare farm or a 55 hectare farm, just take an example of a 50 hectare farm, that difference in profit is €40,000 to €45,000 a year in retained income, or income that's available to the household. So there's a huge advantage on focusing on efficiency. There's a huge advantage at farm level. Again, going back to what we'll be discussing at the Open Day, all of the technical drivers of efficiency will increase profitability. There is huge scope to further increase profitability by increasing utilisation, increasing 6-week calving rate, and all of the other technologies that we see out there.
A roadmap has been developed, where we can earn €2,500 net profit per hectare. Can you briefly outline the performance? You're mentioning utilisation, 6-week calving rate. What does that €2,500 net profit farm look like?
So that €2,500 net profit farm is a farm that's utilising 13 tonnes of grass. They're producing somewhere around 480 kilos of milk solids with less than half a tonne of concentrate. They're calving 90% of the herd in 6 weeks. They have approximately... They're utilising clover, in very much in their system. They're spreading potentially 150 to 200 kilograms of chemical nitrogen. They have a carbon footprint of 0.7, which is like substantially lower than the national average, maybe up to 40% lower than the national average. And they have a labour efficiency of 16 hours per cow, with the national average at somewhere over 30. So there's across all of the metrics that drive efficiency and productivity and profitability, they are substantially ahead than the average.
And if we can put ourselves in the shoes of our average farmer who's at roughly €1,200 net profit per hectare, so they're basically at half that of the target. Can you give us a few tips? If we said now I'm at 1,200 and I want to get to €2,500 net profit, it might seem like a big jump. Maybe 3 tips on how they can kickstart their journey to improve themselves.
And I suppose the first one and probably the most important one is, particularly now where we are in the year, the breeding season is coming, closer to the end. So I suppose the potential to, focus on genetics is less now. So the focus should be on soil fertility and increasing grass growth on the farm. We know nationally we're utilising 18 tonne. We know we can utilise 13 tonne. So how do we get that? And that's really about 2-3 things. One, about understanding which paddocks are performing well, and which paddocks are performing poorly. Once we identify the paddocks that are performing poorly, we have to identify why they're performing poorly. And we have to put an intervention strategy into those paddocks to increase grass growth. So the single biggest driver on profitability is grass utilisation. So if we focus on that at farm level, it'll massively pay the individual farmer.
And just to clarify, it's about 8 tonnes we're utilising at the moment?
Yes.
And our target is 13? Yeah, okay. And then, Brendan, if we look at it, Laurence has mentioned lots of technical farming that we need to get right, and there's lots of targets there. And I think that's fairly in line with the idea of sustainable intensification. And, we've seen links between profitability, technical performance, and also environmental efficiency. Can you talk us through this idea of sustainable intensification and what exactly it means?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose the first thing to say is it's not exclusively an environmental focus. It's about profitable family farms. It's about high quality products and animal and, human friendly systems. And then it's about, really environmentally efficient food production and really clean food production. And I suppose ultimately, in terms of, the long-term picture of it, it's about producing food in a way today that doesn't in any way impinge on future generations to be able to produce the same foods in the same clean ways. So it's about productivity rather than production. It's about producing more, at least the same, and in an Irish context, I would say more food without any increase in requirements for some of the resources that are, whether it be energy or nutrients or so on. So that's kind of like the concept. And, grazing is unique then in terms of its ability to do that. It's because that we can utilise, as Laurence has said, much more pasture on our farms, that actually by utilising more pasture and all the technologies Laurence talked about, we can be more environmentally efficient and more productive. And that's relatively unique. And right across Europe now, there's an acknowledgement that there is a possibility for sustainable intensification of grazing systems, and we're really to the forefront of that. So that's a really good position to be in.
And on that, there's a considerable amount of research being done on increasing stocking rate. And, there is a perception that this expansion and increased cow numbers on farms is having a really detrimental effect. What have you seen, from the research that you've done where you're intensifying, on particular farms?
Sure. So I suppose stocking rate is often linked to environmental decay, because of problems and so on. That happens where you've got increases in fertilizer use, increase in concentrate use and so on, and there's a massive increase in the nutrient loading onto the farms associated with the stocking rate increase. What we're talking about and what Laurence has outlined earlier is about increasing pasture production utilisation efficiency on our farms, not requiring any extra of these nutrients that are, that we lose from our soils and so on. So I suppose the stocking rate story for us is very much about utilising and harnessing extra grass on our farms, doing that efficiently and without any environmental consequence from it. And we have lots of experiments where we've shown that where we can do that.
Laurence touched on clover, and there is a huge increase in the amount of clover being used on farms. Have you a comment on that in terms of the benefits environmentally?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose for me, the clover story, Laurence has put a figure of about €450 a hectare, the extra value of clover in our systems in terms of extra animal performance, improved feed quality, and also a reduction in the requirement for chemical nitrogen fertilizer. So that's, I suppose, the economic motive. From the environmental point of view, Donald O'Brien has estimated that there could be a 10% reduction in emissions associated with displacing that chemical fertilizer with fixed nitrogen in our systems. So that's, I suppose, the potential that's there. It's one of the technologies we're talking about now with farmers. Can we increase clover use on our farms and maintain it at stable levels? And there'll be more research required to do that in order to displace some of this chemical fertilizer and reduce our emissions intensity.
And then just looking at the cow, what can we do with the cow to ensure that we're minimising the carbon footprint of them?
Yeah, so we know again from experiments that have been done here that as we select for more higher EBI animals, that those animals are more fertile, more productive, and therefore reduce our environmental intensity as well. I suppose the big thing around genetic selection is about reducing the requirement for replacements. That's one of the main ones, that if we can have more fertile herds with compact calving, as Laurence has talked about, then we can actually reduce our young stock footprint and therefore become more mature animals, higher productivity and so on. So those are the big contributions. It's important to add though that in terms of, I suppose, a grazing system, we really need efficient ruminants. So animals that can achieve high intakes for their size and, really digest feed efficiency. So really feed efficient animals are also animals that have a high nutrient use efficiency and are environmentally efficient as well. So those two work in tandem.
And just on that, I suppose a figure in terms of what should we target for body weight of these ruminant, the efficient ruminants?
Well, what we've said is because there's a diversity of animals out there in farms, that what we'd like is that farms would aim for about 90% of the body weight in terms of milk solids output. And I suppose to put that in practical terms, that's probably an animal with an average weight of between 525 and 550 kilos, mature weight, a high maintenance subindex in EBI, and therefore, and with high milk solids achieving, 90% of that body weight. So it's the next generation Holstein Friesian, crossbred animals, those both groups would be consistent with that in terms of, really efficient ruminants.
And I suppose a quick rule of thumb, if you're talking about that 550 kilo animal, if you look at your EBI report, it's €20 in terms of maintenance. A comment, Laurence, from you on... You've mentioned there's 380,000 more cows in the country. A lot of expansion has occurred on individual farms, say within existing dairy herds, but also there's been new entrant farms. So more cows means that there has been investment in parlours, sheds, buildings, and also some infrastructure. Has this impacted on the overall debt load on individual farms?
It's a very interesting question, and the answer is not really. There's been very slight increases in debt at farm level, of the order of €10,000 per farm, which, okay, when you look at it, it's a chunk of money, but it's tiny relative to the scale of our industry. Just to put it in context, the average debt on Irish dairy farms is about €900 per cow. The average debt on a New Zealand farm is somewhere around €8,000 per cow. In a Danish farm is €20,000 per cow, and in a Dutch farm is somewhere around €12,000 per farm. So our farms are very lowly indebted. That's the first point. The second point is that when we look at what has happened in the last 10 years, there's been massive investment at farm level. If we just put a conservative estimate of €4,000 per cow for every additional cow between the cow and milking facilities and grazing infrastructure and housing, that amounts to somewhere of the order of €1.5 billion spent on farm or invested on farm, and the debt level hasn't changed. So I think what farmers have done is truly remarkable. Most of the investment has been done outside of debt. Our debt has been taken on and paid back quickly, which really is a very strong indication of the profitability and the sustainability of our systems. Now, sometimes I would argue that maybe farmers put themselves under too much pressure trying to pay off debt too quickly. They see debt as a huge cost in the system, and appropriate debt for the right investments that increase productivity and efficiency is not a bad thing within the system. So I think debt levels are low. They have increased very slightly. Actually, debt per unit of output, because milk output has increased so much, has actually declined quite dramatically over that 10-year period. So debt is a small component of Irish dairy farms.
And would you say that more investment has to be made on farms? You made reference to, with your target net profit, you're targeting a very efficient farm with 16 hours per cow. Are the facilities on farm at the moment to achieve that? Yeah,
and I suppose that could be one of the things that maybe there has been some underinvestment, and I think some of that has to do with the speed of the expansion, and that expansion has been so rapid because we had such a rapid change in policy. Quota's here today, quota's gone tomorrow, and cow numbers have reflected that. And some investments, particularly in, I suppose, calving, calf rearing and calving facilities that probably have lagged a little bit, haven't been prioritised. And I suppose the other thing is in terms of milking facilities where cow numbers have increased to the point now where people are spending too long in the parlour in some situations. So there is a requirement to relook at that. But if we look at the overall industry, there's loads of scope for investment in facilities to I suppose counteract that, because I suppose a number of years ago we would have, labour wasn't such a big thing. Now it is, and certainly some of these investments make sense to reduce the length of the working day, make it more sustainable, increase the quality of life, and secondly to ensure that if we have staff in our system that we can keep them in our system, that our system is sustainable from that point of view.
Yeah, I was just going to add in terms of the roadways and water troughs and the grazing infrastructure, I think we all agree that there is scope for big improvements in those things on many dairy farms. And, it's not all about the shiny steel tanks and so on. It's the other aspects as well, So that'll help that pasture utilisation figure.
And finally then, I suppose a comment from you both. We mentioned there's 380,000 more cows in the country. Have we reached saturation point in terms of the expansion phase in Ireland, in terms of cow numbers, or is there scope for more expansion in the country?
So if we look at the profitability of dairying relative to other enterprises, there is no comparison. Dairying is extremely profitable compared to some of the other enterprises that farmers can be at. Currently, we have ballpark something under 1.5 million dairy cows in the country. If we were to look at at stock that's somewhere over 2 cows per hectare, so that's only 700,000 hectares directly employed with the production of milk in Ireland. There is lots of scope to bring in more land into dairying, more land from currently unprofitable enterprises that could potentially be producing milk. In lots of situations, good quality land that would have no problem for the milk production. So we would say maybe in a little bit more sustainable from the point of view of the speed of expansion. We've had a lot of expansion rapid in the last few years, driven by quota removal. So we would probably see the industry settling down to maybe a 2% increase in cow numbers from now on, which is very sustainable. fueled by land being converted from other enterprises, slightly more or higher stocking rates, as we've said in our own systems. But there's loads of scope for further expansion, as long as policy doesn't restrict it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I suppose, look, we're dealing with a €4 billion industry that's on approximately somewhere between 20 and 25% of the utilisable land area. And I mean, there is, based on the intensity of agriculture and so on, great opportunities for further expansion in the industry that can be profitable, that can be achieved in an environmentally sustainable way. I think also we need to add in there, we've got very innovative dairy farmers, and that's a huge strength in terms of adopting the types of new technologies we need, be it in terms of, the low emissions methods or the protected ureas and those kinds of technologies that will allow us to continue to expand the industry in a profitable way without having any environmental impacts.
Over the last month, there has been maybe a little bit of comment in the media about attracting, maybe schemes for attracting young people into farming. And I suppose the one thing that we have to be sure, if we do want to attract young people into farming, we need to have a farming system or enterprise that's profitable, and we need an enterprise or system that allows that person to progress in their enterprise. So we need to be very careful of any policy instruments or anything like that we might introduce. If we do want to bring young people in, we need to allow them to drive on within their business and to see themselves in a positive light, that they can see a positive future in their business.
And if you look at the last 5-10 years, I mean, the growth in the industry has been what has allowed those young people to come in and massively increase the vibrancy of the whole thing, So if it doesn't grow, it becomes very difficult to attract those young people to further develop the industry in the future.
But grow in a sustainable way. Grow in a way, we don't want to see a situation where we drift away from our only comparative advantage, which is grass-based, into higher input, higher stocking rates, buffer feeding, all that kind of complication within our system. We need to make sure that we don't drift into that type of a system.
So we're maintaining that simple system. And I suppose, finally, when we look at it, the next 5 or so years will be exciting for individual farms. A lot of people that have expanded are dealing with probably young, immature herds. So, productivity and profit should increase on farms in the future. We look forward to hearing more from you at the Open Day. Thanks, guys. And that's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. And my thanks to Brendan Horan and Laurence Shalloo for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.